I've tried several roguelike games in the past, and I'd like to think that the gameplay-focused, fast-paced action should be right up my alley, but it's consistently been a genre that I don't care for all that much. The randomized layouts, repetitive nature, and clear hierarchy of weapons and power-ups with hardly a care for balance leaves a lot for me to desire. But I keep wanting to give these games a try, and I decided to pick up Returnal on a sale and try out what's probably one of the only AAA roguelike games out there. The story follows Celine, a spacefaring adventurer working for the company Astra to explore distant, unknown planets. After picking up a distress signal called the White Shadow, which she recognizes from her life back on Earth, she feels compelled to investigate despite being ordered to withdraw. After a very rough crash landing and getting killed by the local wildlife, Celine soon realizes that she has somehow become entrapped by the planet's curse. She is now in an endless loop of death and rebirth, with no way to escape and no other choice but to push forward and find a way to somehow break the cycle and return home. While the majority of the game is gameplay focused, there are very elongated sequences that are meant to flesh out the story. The planet of Atropos is able to manifest Celine's personal horrors, recreating her house from back on Earth to explore. These sequences can carry on for quite a while, especially if you take your time with them. And it doesn't really do anything too interesting, but it's not bad either. The halfway point of the story is especially great, and it got me excited to finish the game. Although I found the ending to be rather disappointing, but the package as a whole isn't too bad. The other aspects of the presentation, the graphics, art direction, and music are all very good. Each area of the game has a unique look and feel to it, along with plenty of enemy types that are easily identifiable at a glance. Or at least they would be, but the lighting, particle effects, and even elements of the heads-up display can get in the way and make it difficult to dodge the hundreds of bullets flying at you. It's handled well enough thanks to good audio cues and a helpful mini-map that's surprisingly pretty easy to read at a glance, but I do wish that certain things could be made more clear, visually speaking. The music is very quiet and subtle most of the time, but it still does make an impact, especially when it ramps up as the enemy forces grow in number. And there's also one notable exception during a boss fight that really stands out. The gameplay is as polished as the presentation. It's a fast-paced third-person shooter, and although the mobility options are rather limited, it's still fun to run around and shoot stuff. There's no double jump, surprisingly enough, or things like wall running, hovering in midair, or so on. The only other stuff you can do is a short-ranged but invulnerable dash which can go through hazards and enemy projectiles, as well as a grapple you can unlock later in the game. Although the grapple itself is very situational for combat purposes, but it can help open up your options in traversing certain arenas. However, it's almost never required for this. Returnal has some very strange rules, even for a roguelike, such as having infinite ammo and a lack of a traditional weapon reload. Instead, all guns automatically refill their own ammo little by little, unless their stores are completely empty. If that occurs, then a reload animation begins automatically, and the player can speed it up with a proper button timing, kind of similar to Gears of War. Aside from that, it's a very simple way to handle ammo management, which actually feels kind of appropriate considering how fast-paced and frantic this game can be. Returnal's standout feature that they made a big deal about when the game first came out were the adaptive triggers. Press the L2 button halfway to aim your gun, and pull it down all the way to prepare your weapon's alternative fire. There's even a stopping point at the halfway mark to make it feel more comfortable to know where the threshold is, not too dissimilar from the GameCube controller's shoulder buttons. It's a really cool idea that feels great, although in practice, surprisingly enough, this doesn't actually get a whole lot of use. Mobility is king in Returnal, so you'll aim from the hip most of the time just to stay moving. In fact, There's an option to separate the two aiming modes anyway, which certainly helped Returnal get ported to PC. It's a really cool showcase for the PS5's adaptive triggers, but it's really more of a gimmick than anything else. As is common with the genre, the player is rewarded for skillful play, in this case for getting multiple kills without ever taking damage. With a high enough kill streak, Celine's adrenaline gauge will increase, allowing for benefits such as improved reloading and, at the higher levels, bonus money and increased experience points gains. Those last two benefits are so powerful that the key to getting good with the game usually depends on minimizing damage taken, not just for the sake of survivability, but more so for that sweet money and experience points. As you level up, future weapons found on your current run will be stronger, guaranteeing you better gear down the line, and the bonus money earned from maintaining high adrenaline is important to ensure that you can afford more and better equipment from the shops. It also does a neat idea with its health pickups. If you're already at full health, then getting a health pickup will instead increase your maximum health. It's yet another way to reward the player for progressing without taking any damage. Like most roguelikes, a big part of the appeal of the genre is making risk versus reward decisions, and Returnal has quite a few. The different weapon types is the obvious stuff. You can go for something powerful but more specialized, like the shotgun or rocket launcher, or you can go for something weaker but more versatile, like a machine gun. There are also parasites that simultaneously provide positive and negative effects and can be difficult to remove in the middle of a dungeon. The most common decision to make has to do with malignancies and malfunctions. Several items in treasure chests are afflicted with malignancy, and interacting with them has the chance of cursing the player with a debuff. The severity of the debuff and how difficult it is to remove is completely random, but the possibility is always scary enough to make the player think twice about taking that risk. While the positives may be tempting, they don't always outweigh the negatives, and like any roguelike, making it far only to die once is both depressing and devastating.
Enough. I understand. I'm trapped. The broadcast signal. That's all that matters. Astra, Helios is gone. Celine heading out.
As such, you're usually better off playing it safe, which is one of my biggest problems with this game. Most of the times when I would die, it's usually because I would use a subpar weapon for the purposes of trying to upgrade its abilities. See, each weapon will have random attributes attached to it, but they can't be utilized until enough experience has been accumulated. Once the attribute has been unlocked, however, then it stays so even in future playthroughs. The problem is that such attributes only go so far, and if the weapon itself isn't very good, then it won't make much of a difference. In my experience, the rocket launcher with full auto and the shotgun with a narrow maw are acceptable, but the carbine and hollow seeker are the best weapons by far. Sure, the grenade launchers and explosive weapons are powerful, but if an enemy is flying, then you need to land a direct hit, which is hardly ideal for that weapon type. Over half the weapons are simply too situational, and you're often better off going with even a weaker pistol just because it's more reliable. It's such a shame because some of these weapons are actually really cool and creative, but it's just too risky to rely on them when it's so easy to die. Once I stopped caring about experimenting with the other weapons, I actually found the game to be a hell of a lot easier. In fact, I'd argue that this is probably the easiest roguelike I've played. Or at least not nearly as frustrating as what the genre is typically infamous for. Don't get me wrong, its random nature and overwhelming pressure still allows for sneaky and sudden attacks that don't necessarily feel fair, and like I explained earlier, it can be hard to see what's happening at all, let alone react. But as long as you play it safe, keep your distance, and master your limited mobility options, then it's not that hard of a game to beat. It's a very easy game to manipulate and cheese, especially if you leave behind treasure chests until you've leveled up a bunch, and then you go back later to reveal some really powerful weapons. Using the parasite extractor is also an easy way to make good money if you're willing to scour the whole map at the end, which is safe and easy to do once you've already killed all the enemies. This might not be playing in the spirit of the game, but without any incentive to beat it quickly, like Binding of Isaac does as you attempt to race against the clock for better reward opportunities, I'm putting this at the fault of Returnal. None of this makes the game outright bad, but I do have a few major complaints. The first has to do with the permanent upgrades. It is a nice idea to give the player a sense of permanent progression so that their runs that end with death don't feel like a total failure, but the main thing it does is just make the game a whole lot easier. Being able to go underwater, for example, doesn't do anything except reveal more opportunities to gather items. They could have done something a little more interesting with this stuff, which leads into my next complaint. A common trait of roguelike games is a selection of various characters, but Returnal doesn't do this in the slightest. You only ever play as Celine, you always start off with a basic pistol, and there's no customization whatsoever. I could see it being an interesting idea if the player had to choose between a few loadouts, like a double jump instead of a dash, going underwater instead of using the grapple, and so on. I don't know, figure something out. But it really hurts the replay value when you only ever play as the same character. It's not a complete deal breaker, but it is a bit of a shame. What's more disappointing are the boss fights. To be clear, they're all actually pretty good, and each one has unique mechanics that help set it apart from the others. However, there's only 5 of them throughout the whole game, and you fight the same ones over and over. In fact, one of the areas doesn't even have a boss at all, which is really anticlimactic once you finish the map and realize there's no final battle to do there. I suppose I'd rather have a small selection of great bosses rather than a whole bunch of randomized mediocre bosses, but I feel like a better compromise could have been met, especially considering, again, the lack of customization options. Worst of all, however, is the roguelike genre's greatest flaw: a complete disregard for balance. If you get the right combination of weapons, power-ups, and items, then it's basically impossible to lose. There was one time that I had multiple power-ups that allowed me to take damage without having my adrenaline reset, making it a whole lot easier to rack up a huge amount of money and experience points. Anything that provides some form of health regeneration during combat is also crazy good in this game, and some weapon stats and attributes can make a huge difference. However, all of this is based on luck. One time, I got 4 rocket launchers in a row, which you might think sounds awesome, but using them, I had a hard time dealing with fast flying enemies. It's just so stupid. There are so many variables that can either ruin an attempt or make it much easier than it should be. And I hate that slot machine kind of approach to these kinds of games. Skill is a major aspect, don't get me wrong, but I don't like the difficulty being factored so heavily by luck. There's a couple of additional modes to help extend the value of the game which have been added as free DLC. You can play cooperatively online, which certainly helps with how repetitive the game is. Keep in mind though that players will need to share their guns and most supplies, so you're probably going to want to play with a friend to communicate and strategize, or things can easily get a little chaotic. I feel like the netcode isn't quite perfect, but it is good enough and the co-op mode works well. There's also a randomized daily challenge, which puts the player in a shortened mini dungeon with a set gun and a few variables to work around with. In this mode, a score is tracked based on performance and uploaded online. It's okay, not really anything special. You're still playing on the maps from the main game, so you're not really seeing anything new here. What's far more interesting is the most recent DLC, the Tower of Sisyphus. This one takes place in a new map with new arena layouts. Once a room is cleared, the player can't go back, so you'll need to make tough decisions on what weapons and items you'll want to take with you. A high score is also tracked here, with an emphasis on speed, which helps make this mode a lot more exciting, and it even features some exclusive boss fights and new story details. It still suffers from the usual problems that a roguelike has, but it's a good addition to the main game that does a much better job at playing to its strengths. Unfortunately, the Tower of Sisyphus isn't available in co-op, but it still is really good on its own. The main takeaway is this: if you like roguelikes, then you'll like Returnal, but it's worth noting that the replay value is pretty low, and the game is rather easy for a roguelike. If you're not that big into roguelikes, then this one might be better for you to try, but it still does have the common issues with being overly random and totally unbalanced. Without additional characters, customization, and lacking in the number of bosses, it certainly pales in comparison to some of the greats of the genre. But its high level of polish and great controls does help it stand out a lot. Returnal is in this weird gray area. It's not hardcore enough for major roguelike fans, and it's probably too hardcore for most casual players, on top of having a price tag far higher than what's usually expected of the genre, while also having a lot less content to it. I can't give it a heavy recommendation, and I want to be clear that I am biased against roguelikes as a whole. I feel like the genre itself is just fundamentally flawed, but if some of this stuff sounds good to you, then I don't think that this is a bad game at all. Go for it if you're interested, but if you're not, then I don't think you're missing out on much. Thanks for watching my review on Returnal.